Jake Morrison sat in the cold metal chair and stared at the blue hologram floating above Admiral Patricia Collins's desk. The image showed a creature that looked like something from his worst nightmares. 7 meters tall, covered in dark red, scales that gleamed like metal, with powerful wings folded against its massive back. Yellow eyes burned with intelligence, and what looked like barely controlled rage. "This is what we're dealing with," Admiral Collins said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "The Drakmori Empire. They've been watching us for 20 years and now they want to talk." Jake had been a diplomat for 15 years. He had negotiated peace treaties between warring human colonies. He had talked hostile alien traders into fair deals. He had even convinced the stubborn Centauri Republic to share their medical technology. But this was different. This was terrifying. "They agreed to meet?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Yes, but on their terms," Collins replied. She waved her hand and the hologram changed to show a space station. "Harmony Point, neutral territory. They'll bring their full ceremonial guard." Jake studied the station's layout. It was big enough to handle large ships, but if things went wrong, there would be nowhere to run. "What do we know about their culture?" Dr. Kevin Brooks leaned forward, from his seat across the table. The xenobiologist looked tired, like he had been working on this problem for weeks. "They respect strength above everything else. Physical dominance determines social rank in their society. They've met with 12 other alien species over the past 50 years. "How did those meetings go?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Badly," Brooks said. "The Drakmori declared 11 of those species as prey races and absorbed them into their empire as servants. The 12th species was strong enough to fight back, so the Drakmori destroyed their entire civilization." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "And they want to meet with us because—" Admiral Collins manipulated the hologram again. It showed a map of local space, with red zones marking Drakmori territory and blue zones showing human space. "We're expanding in opposite directions, but our borders are about to touch. 3 star systems are in dispute. These systems contain rare metals we need for our new drive technology." Captain Lisa Hayes spoke up for the first time. She would be commanding the ship that carried Jake to this meeting. "Intelligence says the Drakmori have been studying our military capabilities. They know we can't match them in a straight fight." "How outgunned are we?" Jake asked. "Their smallest warship could destroy our largest battleship," Hayes said bluntly. "But they seem interested in talking instead of just taking what they want. That's unusual for them." Dr. Amy Rodriguez, the linguistics expert, spread her tablet on the table. "I've been working on their language for months. It's incredibly complex. They communicate with vocal sounds, but also with body posture, wing positions, and scale color changes. Miss any part of it, and you could accidentally declare war." Jake looked around the room at the faces of his team. These were good people, experts in their fields, but they all looked worried. "Why me? Why not send someone with more experience in hostile negotiations?" "Because you have something the others don't," Admiral Collins said. "You think differently. Every other diplomat we've considered approaches problems the same way. Traditional methods, standard protocols. The Drakmori have seen all of that before." "And it didn't work," Jake said. "Exactly. We need someone who can surprise them." Jake stood up and walked to the viewport. Outside, he could see the blue and white marble of Earth turning slowly in space. Somewhere down there, 4 billion humans were going about their daily lives, unaware that their future might depend on one conversation with giant dragon-like aliens. "What happens if I fail?" he asked. "Best case scenario, we lose access to those 3 star systems and our expansion stops," Collins said. "Worst case, the Drakmori decide we're a threat and wipe out human civilization." Jake turned back to the group. "No pressure then." Dr. Brooks pulled up another file on his tablet. "There is one thing that might help. The Drakmori have a concept called worthiness trials. If they respect someone enough, they'll test them instead of just dismissing them. It's rare, but it has happened." "What kind of tests?" Jake asked. "Physical challenges, mental puzzles, survival scenarios." The details change, but the goal is always the same. Prove you deserve to be treated as an equal rather than prey. Captain Hayes crossed her arms. Jake, you're a good diplomat, but you're not a warrior. These creatures are built for combat. That's exactly why it might work, Jake said, an idea forming in his mind. They expect strength. They expect aggression. What if we give them something completely different? Admiral Collins raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Every species they've met has tried to match their strength or cowered in fear. What if we show them that humans have a different kind of strength? What if we challenge their assumptions about what makes someone worthy? Dr. Rodriguez looked skeptical. That's incredibly risky. If you offend them, they might attack immediately. If we do nothing different, we'll definitely fail, Jake said. At least this way, we have a chance. The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Admiral Collins nodded. All right, Ambassador Morrison. You have authorization to proceed. Your team will include Dr. Brooks for alien psychology, Dr. Rodriguez for translation, and Captain Hayes will command your transport ship, the UNS Peacekeeper. What about security? Jake asked. Colonel Alex Carter and a small Marine detachment, Collins said. But remember, if fighting starts, you're all dead anyway. Your job is to make sure fighting never starts. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. The Drakmori are already on their way to Harmony Point. Overlord Vax Thresh will be their chief negotiator. Everything we know about him suggests he's intelligent, proud, and has never lost a negotiation. Wonderful, Jake muttered. Dr. Brooks handed him a thick folder. Everything we know about Drakmori culture, biology, and psychology. Study it carefully. Your life depends on understanding these creatures. As the meeting broke up, Jake remained by the viewport, staring out at Earth. In 24 hours, he would be sitting across from a 7-meter-tall dragon alien, trying to convince it that humanity deserved to exist as equals in the galaxy. The fate of his entire species would rest on his ability to find common ground with a creature that viewed smaller beings as prey. Captain Hayes approached him. Second thoughts? A million of them, Jake admitted. But someone has to do this job. Might as well be me. For what it's worth, I think Collins is right. You do think differently than most diplomats. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. Jake smiled grimly. Let's hope the Drakmori think so too. The next morning, Jake stood in the shuttle bay of the UNS Peacekeeper, watching Earth shrink in the distance. In his bag, he carried the cultural files, translation protocols, and emergency procedures. In his mind, he carried the hopes and fears of 4 billion humans. The journey to Harmony Point would take 3 days. 3 days to prepare for the most important conversation in human history. 3 days to figure out how to convince a species of dragon-like conquerors that humanity was worth keeping alive. As the Peacekeeper entered hyperspace, Jake Morrison began to plan for the most dangerous diplomatic mission ever attempted. 3 days later, Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Peacekeeper and watched Harmony Point grow larger on the main screen. The space station looked like a giant wheel spinning slowly against the starfield. It was neutral territory, built by the Galactic Commerce Guild for meetings between different alien species. But Jake's attention was fixed on the massive ship docked at the station's upper port. The Flame of Dominion was 3 times the size of the Peacekeeper, its hull, black as space with red markings that pulsed like a heartbeat. Weapon ports lined its sides and heat waves shimmered around its engines even though the ship was powered down. My God, Captain Hayes whispered. That thing could turn us into atoms before we knew what hit us. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Dr. Rodriguez checked her translation equipment one more time. Jake, remember what we practiced. The Drakmori greeting involves lowering your head slightly and keeping your hands visible. Don't make direct eye contact until they acknowledge you first. Got it, Jake said. He had spent the entire 3-day journey studying Drakmori culture, but he still felt unprepared. The docking process took 20 minutes. As soon as the airlock sealed, Jake could hear deep voices speaking in the Drakmori language. It sounded like thunder mixed with breaking rocks. They're already here, Dr. Brooks said, checking his scanner. 6 of them, including Overlord Vax Thresh. Their body temperatures are running hot, which could indicate excitement or aggression. Or both, Jake muttered. The inner airlock door opened, and Jake got his first look at Harmony Point's meeting chamber. The room was huge, designed to accommodate species of different sizes. The ceiling was 15 meters high, and the floor was made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light. At the far end of the room, 6 enormous figures waited. Jake had seen the images, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. The Drakmori were massive, their scales catching the light like polished armor. Their wings were folded but still visible, and their eyes glowed with an inner fire that made Jake's skin crawl. The largest of them stepped forward. This had to be Overlord Vax Thresh. His scales were darker than the others, almost black with red edges. Scars covered his arms and chest, telling stories of battles Jake could only imagine. When the creature opened his mouth, Jake could see teeth like daggers. So, Vax Thresh said in accented but clear English, "These are the humans." His voice was so deep that Jake felt it in his chest. The other Drakmori spread out behind their leader, forming a wall of muscle and claws. Jake realized that any one of them could tear him apart without effort. Jake stepped forward, remembering his training. He lowered his head slightly and kept his hands where the aliens could see them. "Overlord Vax Thresh, I am Ambassador Jake Morrison, representing humanity in these negotiations." He waited for acknowledgement before looking up. When he did, he found himself staring into yellow eyes that seemed to burn with ancient intelligence. "Ambassador," Vax Thresh said, and Jake heard amusement in the alien's voice. Such a small word for such a small creature. The other Drakmori made sounds that Jake realized were laughter. It sounded like rocks grinding together. "You wish to negotiate with the Drakmori Empire," Vax Thresh continued. "But tell me, little human, what makes you think you are worthy of our time?" This was the moment Jake had been preparing for. Every instinct told him to be respectful, to try to appear non-threatening. But his research had taught him something important about Drakmori culture. They respected only strength. Instead of backing down, Jake stepped closer. "Because we're here," he said simply. The laughter stopped. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the station's life support systems. "You're here," Vax Thresh repeated, slowly. "Yes. You invited us to negotiate because you recognize that humanity is expanding into space. We're not going away. We're not hiding. We're here, and we're not afraid to meet with you face to face." One of the other Drakmori, a female with bright red scales, hissed something in their language. Dr. Rodriguez whispered a translation in Jake's earpiece. "She says we smell like prey." Vax Thresh held up a clawed hand for silence. "You say you are not afraid, human, but your body tells a different story. I can smell your fear sweat. I can hear your heart beating like a prey animal that knows it is about to die." Jake felt his face grow hot, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Of course, I'm afraid. I'd be stupid not to be. You could kill all of us without breaking a sweat, but fear and cowardice are different things. A coward runs away. We came here." "Interesting," Vax Thresh said. He began to pace, his claws clicking on the metal floor. "Most species either try to convince us they are strong, or they immediately offer to surrender. You do neither." "Because neither would work," Jake said. "We're not as strong as you are, and we're not ready to surrender. So we need to find a third option." "There is no third option," said another Drakmori warrior. His scales were covered in battle scars. "There are only the strong and the prey. You are clearly prey." Jake turned to face the warrior. "Really? Then why are we having this conversation at all? If we're just prey, why didn't you simply attack our colonies and take what you wanted?" The warrior started to respond, but Vax Thresh silenced him with a look. "Continue, Ambassador," the Overlord said. "You're here because something about us made you curious," Jake said. "Maybe it's because we've survived in space for longer than most species you've encountered. Maybe it's because our military tactics are unpredictable. Or maybe it's because we keep surprising you. Humans are unusual," Vax Thresh admitted. Your species expands quickly, but you do not conquer. You fight wars, but you also make peace. You are weak individually, but strong in groups. It is confusing. It's called adaptability, Jake said. We survive by changing, by finding new solutions to old problems. It's not the same as physical strength, but it is a kind of power. The female Drakmori spoke again. This time, Dr. Rodriguez's translation came through clearly. She wants to know what kind of power could possibly matter if we cannot defend ourselves in battle. Jake smiled. The power to make you curious enough to talk instead of fight. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The Drakmori looked at each other, communicating in ways that Jake couldn't understand. Their scales shifted color slightly, and their wing positions changed in subtle patterns. Finally, Vax Thresh turned back to Jake. You amuse me, little human, but amusement is not respect. You speak of human adaptability as if it were equal to Drakmori's strength. This is clearly false. Is it? Jake asked. You've conquered dozens of worlds using the same tactics. Overwhelming. Force applied directly. It's worked every time. But what happens when you face an enemy that doesn't respond to overwhelming force the way you expect? We apply more force, the scarred warrior said. And if that doesn't work? It always works, the warrior insisted. Always? Jake looked directly at Vax Thresh. Then why are you expanding so carefully? Why build alliances with some species instead of just conquering everyone? Why agree to meet with us at all? Vax Thresh's eyes narrowed. You know nothing of our strategic concerns. I know that every empire faces challenges that can't be solved with brute force alone, Jake said. Politics, logistics, unknown threats. The kind of problems that require different kinds of thinking. You suggest that we need your help? The Overlord's voice carried a dangerous edge. I suggest that maybe strength comes in different forms, Jake said carefully. And maybe the strongest empires are the ones that can recognize and use all kinds of strength. The room fell silent again. Jake could feel his heart pounding, but he forced himself to stand straight and meet Vax Thresh's burning gaze. You are either very brave or very stupid, the Overlord said finally. Probably both, Jake admitted. To his surprise, Vax Thresh made a sound that might have been laughter. Very well, Ambassador Morrison. You have succeeded in making me curious. But curiosity is not agreement. If you truly believe that human adaptability equals Drakmori strength, then prove it. How? Trials, Vax Thresh said. 3 tests to determine whether your species deserves to be treated as equals or prey. Physical capability, mental acuity, and survival instinct. Win all 3, and we will negotiate as equals. Lose even 1, and humanity becomes a client species of the Drakmori Empire. Jake felt the weight of 4 billion lives pressing down on him. And if we refuse? Then we end this conversation and proceed with our original plan for your colonies. Jake looked back at his team. Dr. Brooks looked terrified. Dr. Rodriguez was frantically checking her translation equipment. Captain Hayes was calculating odds, and clearly not liking the results. But Jake had known from the beginning that conventional diplomacy wouldn't work with the Drakmori. They respected only strength. But Jake was beginning to understand that they had a broader definition of strength than most people realized. We accept, he said. 2 hours later, Jake stood in Harmony Point's cargo bay watching the Drakmori prepare for the first trial. They had transformed the huge space into an arena by moving containers and equipment to form obstacles and challenges. The air hummed, with tension as both human and alien delegations gathered to watch. Overlord Vax Thresh stood at the center of the makeshift arena, his massive form casting long shadows under the bright lights. The first trial tests physical capability, he announced, his voice echoing off the metal walls. Your champion will face our warrior Thekmaron in a contest of strength and endurance. Jake looked at the Drakmori warrior who stepped forward. Thekmaron was nearly 8 meters tall, even larger than the others. His muscles bulged under dark green scales and old battle scars covered his arms like trophies. When he flexed his claws, they gleamed like knives. The challenge is simple, Vax Thresh continued. Move these containers from one end of the bay to the other. Navigate the obstacles we have prepared. Complete the course fastest and your species wins the first trial. Jake examined the course they had built. Heavy metal containers weighing several tons each were scattered throughout the bay. Barriers, ramps, and narrow passages created a complex maze. Some containers had to be lifted over barriers 3 meters high. Others had to be pushed through tight spaces barely wide enough for the boxes themselves. Colonel Alex Carter stepped forward from the human group. "I'll do it," he said quietly. Jake studied his security chief. Carter was strong for a human with years of military training behind him, but compared to Thekamaran, he looked like a child facing a giant. "Alex, are you sure?" Jake asked. "I've been thinking about this since we arrived," Carter said. "Look at that course. It's designed for someone with Drakmori strength, but maybe that's not the only way to complete it." Carter walked to the starting line where the first container waited. The metal box was 3 meters on each side and looked impossibly heavy. Thekmaran moved to the identical container beside it, his claws scraping the floor. "Begin," Vax Thresh commanded. Thekmaran immediately grabbed his container and lifted it above his head. His muscles strained, but the massive Drakmori carried the box like it weighed nothing. He began moving toward the first obstacle, a wall 3 meters high that the container would have to go over. Carter took a completely different approach. Instead of trying to lift his container, he examined it carefully. He found handholds built into the sides and began pushing it forward on its bottom edge, walking it along like a giant dice. The other Drakmori made sounds of amusement. "The human pushes his burden like a weakling," one of them said loud enough for everyone to hear. But Carter ignored them. When he reached the 3-meter wall, he didn't try to lift the container over it. Instead, he found loose cables hanging from the ceiling crane system. Working quickly, he rigged a simple pulley arrangement using the cables and some equipment from nearby storage areas. Thekmaran had already thrown his container over the wall and was moving toward the next obstacle, but Jake noticed that the Drakmori warrior was breathing hard. The containers were heavy even for someone of his size. Carter finished his pulley system and began hauling his container up the wall. It took longer than Thekmaran's method, but Carter barely seemed winded. The mechanical advantage of the pulleys did most of the work for him. "Clever," Dr. Brooks whispered. "He's using tools and physics instead of raw strength." The next obstacle was a narrow passage between 2 walls. The containers barely fit through, and they had to be maneuvered carefully to avoid getting stuck. Thekmaran forced his box through by pushing with all his strength, scraping paint off the walls and denting the container's edges. Carter again took time to study the problem. He noticed that the passage was slightly wider at the top than at the bottom. By tilting his container at an angle and using leverage from a metal bar he found, he was able to slide it through without damage and with much less effort. By the 4th obstacle, Thekmaran was starting to slow down. The Drakmori had relied on pure strength for each challenge, and the repeated heavy lifting was taking its toll. Sweat gleamed on his scales and his breathing was labored. Carter, meanwhile, seemed to be getting faster as he learned to read each challenge and find the most efficient solution. He used ramps instead of lifting, rollers instead of carrying, and leverage instead of brute force. The final obstacle was the most difficult. The containers had to be moved up a steep ramp to a platform 4 meters high. There were no tools provided, and the ramp was too steep for the containers to roll up on their own. Thekmaran reached the ramp first, but he was clearly exhausted. He tried to carry his container up the slope, but halfway up his strength gave out. The container slipped from his grasp and crashed back down to the bottom. The sound echoed through the cargo bay like thunder. The Drakmori warrior roared in frustration and tried again. This time he made it 3/4 of the way up before his legs buckled. Again the container tumbled down the ramp. Carter arrived at the ramp as Thekmaran was making his 3rd attempt. The human watched for a moment, then began examining the ramp structure itself. He noticed that support struts underneath the ramp created a series of ledges. Instead of trying to carry his container straight up, Carter began moving it up the ramp in stages. He would push it to the first ledge, then use the support struts as anchor points to prevent it from rolling back while he repositioned himself. Step by step, ledge by ledge, he worked his way up the ramp. It was slow work, but it was steady. Meanwhile, Thekmaran was making his 4th attempt to power his way up the ramp. The Drakmori's strength was impressive, but he was fighting against gravity and his own exhaustion. Carter reached the top platform first. He had completed the course using perhaps 1/10 the physical effort that Thekmaron had expended. The Koimo. Human wasn't even breathing hard. Thekmaron finally managed to get his container to the top, but he collapsed immediately afterward. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, and his scales had shifted to a paler color that Carter had learned indicated exhaustion. The cargo bay fell silent. The Drakmori delegation stared at Carter with expressions that Jake couldn't read. Had they failed to understand what just happened? Were they angry that their warrior had been defeated? Finally, Overlord Vax Thresh spoke. "The human wins the first trial," he said, but his voice sounded puzzled rather than pleased or angry. "How?" asked the female Drakmori with red scales. "Thekmaron is 10 times stronger than the human. This makes no sense." Dr. Brooks stepped forward. "If I may explain," he said carefully. "Colonel Carter didn't try to match your warrior's strength. Instead, he used different kinds of strength. Knowledge of physics, creative problem-solving, and efficient use of energy." "This is not strength," Thekmaron gasped from where he lay, on the platform. "This is trickery." "Is it?" Jake asked. "Your warrior used his muscles. Our warrior used his brain. Both got the job done, but one method was more effective." Vax Thresh studied Carter, who was helping Thekmaron to his feet, despite having just defeated him. "You did not attempt to overpower our warrior directly." "That would have been stupid," Carter said simply. "He's obviously stronger than me. But the challenge wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who could move the containers faster." "You used tools," said another Drakmori. "I used what was available," Carter replied. "Isn't that what strength really means? Using everything you have to overcome obstacles?" The Drakmori began, talking among themselves in their own language. Their scales shifted colors, and their wing positions changed in patterns that Jake was beginning to recognize as heated discussion. "They're arguing about whether tool use counts as legitimate strength," Dr. Rodriguez whispered to Jake. "Some think it's cheating. Others think it shows intelligence." The argument continued for several minutes. Jake watched Vax Thresh carefully. The Overlord wasn't participating in the debate, but his yellow eyes were fixed on Carter with what looked like newfound interest. Finally, Vax Thresh raised his hand for silence. "The human wins the first trial," he repeated. "The method was unexpected, but the rules said only that the containers must be moved through the course. They did not specify how." Some of the other Drakmori looked unhappy with this decision, but none challenged their leader directly. "However," Vax Thresh continued, "this victory proves nothing about your species' worthiness. Physical strength is only one form of power. The next trial will test your mental capabilities. We shall see if human cleverness extends beyond moving boxes." Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won the first trial, but Vax Thresh's tone suggested that he was not impressed. The Overlord seemed to view Carter's victory as an interesting trick rather than proof of human capability. "What will the second trial involve?" Jake asked. "Strategy and tactics," Vax Thresh replied. "Your species claims to be adaptable. We shall test this claim in simulated combat. Our strategist Zarketh will face your chosen champion in a battle of minds." Jake looked at his team. Dr. Brooks was their best tactical thinker, but he was a scientist, not a military strategist. This trial would be even more challenging than the first, but they had come this far. There was no turning back now. "We accept the second trial," Jake said. The next morning, Jake stood in Harmony Point's command center, watching technicians set up the equipment for the second trial. The room buzzed with activity as both humans and station personnel prepared the tactical simulation system. Large, holographic display surrounded 2 command chairs positioned at opposite ends of the room. Dr. Kevin Brooks sat in one of the chairs studying the control interface. He looked nervous, but determined. Across from him, the Drakmori strategist Zarketh settled into a specially reinforced chair designed for his massive frame. The alien silver scales gleamed under the bright lights, and his intelligent eyes studied the human with obvious curiosity. The second trial tests mental capability, Overlord Vax Thresh announced to the assembled groups. Both commanders will control fleets in simulated combat. The scenario is asteroid field warfare with limited resources and incomplete intelligence. Victory goes to whoever destroys the enemy command ship or forces surrender. Jake watched the holographic display spring to life. A three-dimensional map appeared, showing a dense asteroid field scattered across several cubic kilometers of space. Minerals glowed in different colors throughout the field, indicating resources that could be harvested for ship construction and repairs. Each commander begins with 10 ships, Vax Thresh continued. Frigates, destroyers, and 1 command vessel. Additional ships may be constructed using mined resources, but this takes time and leaves mining vessels vulnerable to attack. Dr. Brooks studied his starting fleet. The ships appeared as blue dots on his display, while Zarketh's forces showed as red. Both fleets started at opposite edges of the asteroid field, hidden from each other by the rocky debris. The simulation includes realistic physics and communication delays, explained the station's technical officer. Long-range sensors work poorly in the asteroid field due to interference. You must scout carefully to find your enemy. Zarketh spoke for the first time since entering the room. His voice was deep and confident. Human, I have commanded fleets in battle for over 50 years. I have never lost a simulation or a real engagement. Your species' tactical knowledge is limited to fighting other humans. You have no experience with true strategic thinking. We'll see, Dr. Brooks replied quietly. Begin simulation, Vax Thresh commanded. Both commanders immediately began issuing orders. Jake watched Brooks divide his fleet into 3 groups. One group moved deeper into the asteroid field to establish a mining operation. Another spread out to form a sensor network. The third group, including his command ship, took a defensive position near a cluster of large asteroids. Zarketh took a more aggressive approach. He kept his fleet together and began a systematic sweep of the asteroid field, moving in a tight formation that could respond quickly to any threat. It was the classic Drakmori strategy, overwhelming force applied directly to the enemy's strongest point. Interesting, Dr. Rodriguez whispered to Jake. Brooks is playing defensively, that's not what I expected. Look at how he's positioning his mining ships, Jake replied. He's not just trying to gather resources, he's using them as an early warning system. For the first hour, neither commander found the other. Zarketh's fleet moved through the asteroid field like a predator hunting prey, while Brooks's scattered forces gathered intelligence and resources. The Drakmori strategy was simple and direct, but it was also predictable. Brooks' first innovation came when his mining ships detected Zarketh's approach. Instead of running or calling for help, the mining vessels began moving asteroids. They used their industrial equipment to push large rocks into new positions, creating obstacles in Zarketh's path. What is the human doing? Asked Thekmaron, still recovering from yesterday's physical trial. He's changing the battlefield, Jake realized. Those asteroids aren't just obstacles, he's creating choke points and hiding places. Zarketh seemed puzzled by this tactic but adapted quickly. He split his fleet to go around the new obstacles, maintaining his aggressive advance. His ships were faster and more powerful than Brooks's vessels, and he clearly expected to win through superior firepower. The first engagement came when Zarketh's scouts encountered Brooks's outer sensor network. The human ships were outnumbered and outgunned, but instead of fighting, they retreated deeper into the asteroid field while broadcasting false sensor readings. Deception, Zarketh said with what sounded like approval. Crude, but effective. But Brooks wasn't finished. As Zarketh's ships pursued the retreating scouts, they flew into a carefully prepared trap. Mining charges originally meant for breaking apart asteroids had been attached to floating rocks throughout the area. When the Drakmori ships passed through, Brooks triggered the explosives. The asteroid field erupted in a chain of explosions. Zarketh lost 2 destroyers instantly, and a third was badly damaged. The remaining ships found themselves scattered and confused, surrounded by debris and unable to maintain formation. Impossible, breathed the female Drakmori with red scales. He turned mining equipment into weapons. Brooks pressed his advantage immediately. His scattered fleet converged on Zarketh's position from multiple directions, using the explosion's chaos to mask their approach. But instead of attacking the strongest ships, Brooks focused on isolating and destroying the damaged destroyer. Zarketh tried to regroup his forces, but Brooks had anticipated this. More mining charges detonated, creating new obstacles and preventing the Drakmori ships from forming their preferred tight formation. The human fleet darted between asteroids like fish through coral, impossible to pin down or engage decisively. "This is not honorable combat," Thekmoron complained. "The human hides and uses tricks instead of fighting directly." "War is not about honor," Colonel Carter said from where he stood with the human delegation. "It's about winning." The battle continued for another 2 hours. Zarketh adapted to Brooks's unconventional tactics, but every time the Drakmori strategist found a counter-strategy, Brooks changed his approach. The human used hit-and-run attacks, false retreats, and even psychological warfare by broadcasting fake communications to confuse enemy coordination. Most innovative of all, Brooks began using his command ship as bait. He would expose it to enemy fire, then retreat when Zarketh took the bait. This forced the Drakmori fleet to chase the human command ship through increasingly dangerous parts of the asteroid field, where Brooks had prepared more surprises. The turning point came when Zarketh finally cornered Brooks's command ship in a dead-end canyon between massive asteroids. The Drakmori fleet moved in for the kill, confident that they had finally trapped their elusive prey. But Brooks had one more surprise. His mining ships had been quietly working throughout the battle, not just moving asteroids but weakening the structural supports of the canyon walls. When Zarketh's ships entered the trap, Brooks triggered controlled collapses that brought thousands of tons of rock down on the attacking fleet. Zarketh's command ship survived, but most of his remaining fleet was destroyed or disabled. The Drakmori strategist found himself outnumbered and surrounded by Brooks' remaining forces. "Do you surrender?" Brooks asked over the communication channel. For a long moment, Zarketh said nothing. Then slowly, he began to laugh. It was a deep, rumbling sound that filled the command center. "I surrender," the Drakmori strategist said. "In 50 years of command, I have never faced tactics like these. You fight like no species I have encountered." The simulation ended and the holographic displays faded. Brooks leaned back in his chair, exhausted but victorious. Zarketh stood and walked over to the human, his massive form casting a shadow over the command chair. "Explain your strategy," the Drakmori demanded, but his tone was curious rather than angry. "You kept your fleet together and attacked directly," Brooks said. "It's a good strategy against enemies who fight the same way. But I didn't try to match your strength. I used the environment, turned tools into weapons, and forced you to fight on my terms instead of yours. You sacrificed ships to achieve positioning," Zarketh observed. "You used deception and misdirection. You showed no concern for honorable combat." "I showed concern for winning," Brooks replied. "Honor doesn't help if you're dead." Zarketh was quiet for a moment, his scales shifting to a thoughtful blue color. "Your tactics were chaotic, unpredictable. I could not anticipate your next move because you did not follow any logical pattern." "That's the point," Brooks said. "If your enemy can predict what you'll do, you've already lost." Overlord Vax Thresh had been watching the entire exchange in silence. Now he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The human wins the second trial," he announced. Dr. Brooks demonstrated tactical thinking that our strategist could not counter. Some of the other Drakmori looked unhappy with this outcome, but Zarketh himself seemed fascinated rather than defeated. "This human," Zarketh said to Vax Thresh, "fights like the enemy we have been struggling against in the outer systems. Unpredictable, adaptive, using the environment as a weapon." Jake saw something change in Vax Thresh's expression. The Overlord's eyes narrowed as he studied Brooks with new interest. "Indeed," Vax Thresh said slowly. "Most interesting. Perhaps there is more to human capability than we initially assumed." "2 trials remain," Jake said carefully. "What is the third test?" Jake Morrison stood at the entrance to Harmony Point's environmental simulation chamber and tried to control his breathing. Through the thick glass window, he could see a frozen wasteland that looked like it belonged on the surface of an ice planet. Snow swirled in howling winds and the temperature display showed -40 degrees. 24 hours, Overlord Vax Thresh said, his massive form filling the corridor behind Jake. The environment will change every 6 hours. Frozen tundra, desert heat, toxic atmosphere, and finally a predator scenario. Survive all 4 phases, and your species earns the right to negotiate as equals. Jake looked at the survival gear he was allowed to carry. Basic clothing, a small knife, a water container, and some emergency food. Nothing that would give him a significant advantage against the harsh environments ahead. "What gear do you get?" Jake asked. Vax Thresh gestured to his own massive form. "My scales, my strength, my natural abilities. Nothing more. This trial tests survival instinct in its purest form." Dr. Brooks approached them holding a medical scanner. "Jake, your heart rate is elevated but stable. Remember what we discussed about human advantages in survival situations. Adaptability and problem solving," Jake said, reviewing the brief survival course his team had given him over the past day. "Exactly. Don't try to be stronger than him. Be smarter." The chamber door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Cold, air rushed out carrying the bite of Arctic wind. Jake pulled his jacket tighter and stepped inside. Vax Thresh followed, his scales already shifting to a darker color. In Drakmori culture, survival trials are sacred. They determine fitness to lead. "I have never lost such a trial. There's a first time for everything," Jake said, though he felt far from confident. The door sealed behind them with a solid thunk. They were alone in the frozen wilderness, with only their wits and will to survive. The first hour was the worst. Jake's fingers went numb almost immediately, and his breath formed clouds that froze and fell like tiny crystals. He watched Vax Thresh stride through the snow as if the cold meant nothing to him. The Drakmori's natural insulation and internal heating systems made him perfectly adapted for this environment. Jake, on the other hand, was already shivering. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. While Vax Thresh simply stood in the open, conserving energy and waiting for the environment to change, Jake began gathering materials. Broken chunks of ice could be stacked to create wind barriers. The chamber's walls had maintenance panels that could be removed and used as building materials. Working quickly despite his numb fingers, Jake constructed a crude but effective lean-to shelter against the chamber wall. He used his body heat to create a small warm space inside, then began the tedious process of maintaining a fire using debris and his knife to create sparks. "Interesting," Vax Thresh observed, watching Jake's frantic activity. "You expend energy to create comfort. I simply endure." "Different strategies," Jake replied through chattering teeth. "We'll see which works better." As the hours passed, Jake's shelter proved its worth. While Vax Thresh stood motionless in the blowing snow, Jake remained relatively warm and was able to rest in shifts. He even managed to melt snow for drinking water using his small fire. When the 6-hour mark approached, Jake felt a surge of confidence. He had survived the first phase while maintaining his energy levels. Vax Thresh looked unchanged, but Jake noticed that even the Drakmori had positioned himself to block some of the wind. The environment shifted suddenly. The frozen wasteland melted away, replaced by burning sand dunes under a merciless sun. The temperature display jumped to 50 degrees Celsius. Jake's shelter became useless in seconds as the heat began to build. This phase favored neither of them initially. Vax Thresh's massive body, adapted for retaining heat, now worked against him. His scales began to shift color again, this time to a lighter shade that reflected more sunlight. But his size meant he needed enormous amounts of water to stay functional. Jake had different problems. His human body was better at cooling itself through sweating, but he had limited water supplies. He needed to find shade and minimize his activity during the hottest parts of the cycle. Using the chamber's built-in day-night cycle, Jake discovered that the metal walls created shadows at certain times. He followed these shadows around the chamber, staying cool when possible and digging shallow pits in the sand for insulation when shade wasn't available. Vax Thresh tried to simply power through the heat as he had the cold, but Jake could see the massive alien was struggling. The Drakmori's breathing became labored, and he began seeking shade despite his earlier claims that endurance was superior to comfort. "The heat affects you more than you expected," Jake observed during one of their brief encounters at a shadow area. "Desert conditions are challenging for my species," Vax Thresh admitted. "We evolved on a world with stable temperatures." Jake shared some of his water with the struggling alien. It was a risk since he didn't know what the remaining phases would demand, but it seemed like the right thing to do. Vax Thresh stared at Jake in surprise. "Why do you aid me? We are competitors in this trial." "Because we're both trying to survive," Jake said simply. "Competition doesn't have to mean cruelty." The gesture seemed to affect Vax Thresh more than Jake had expected. The Drakmori studied him with those burning yellow eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. The third phase brought toxic atmosphere. Poisonous green gas began filling the chamber, forcing both contestants to find ways to breathe without dying. This was perhaps the most dangerous phase, as there was no way to fight poison directly. Jake remembered his emergency training and began fashioning a crude rebreather from his clothing and water container. By filtering the air through damp cloth and breathing slowly, he could reduce the amount of poison entering his lungs. Vax Thresh used his species' ability to hold their breath for extended periods, but even Drakmori couldn't go without air forever. As the hours passed, the alien was forced to take occasional breaths of the toxic air. Jake's improvised protection wasn't perfect, but it allowed him to breathe more regularly than Vax Thresh. He found himself helping the Drakmori again, showing him how to construct a similar filter system using materials from the chamber. "Again you aid me," Vax Thresh said, his voice muffled by the improvised mask. "This is not logical behavior for a survival trial." "Maybe survival isn't just about lasting longer than the other guy," Jake replied. "Maybe it's about making sure everyone gets through alive." The final phase was the most frightening. The toxic gas cleared, replaced by the sounds of hunting predators. The chamber's holographic systems created the illusion of dangerous creatures stalking them through a dark forest environment. The predators weren't real, but the simulation was designed to test psychological survival instincts. Fear and panic could be just as deadly as any physical threat. Vax Thresh immediately prepared to fight the creatures directly, his claws extending and his muscles tensing for combat. It was the natural Drakmori response to any threat. Jake took a different approach. Instead of preparing for battle, he studied the predators' behavior patterns. They moved in predictable patrol routes and seemed to respond to specific triggers. Rather than fighting them, Jake found ways to avoid them entirely. When one of the simulated creatures cornered Vax Thresh, Jake created a distraction that allowed the Drakmori to escape without fighting. When Jake found himself trapped, Vax Thresh returned the favor by using his intimidating presence to drive the creature away. They began working together without discussing it, covering each other's weaknesses and sharing information about the predator's patterns. Jake's quick thinking combined with Vax Thresh's physical presence created a partnership that neither could have achieved alone. When the 24-hour trial finally ended, both contestants had survived all 4 phases. But something had changed between them during those long hours of shared struggle. The chamber door opened, and Jake's team rushed inside to check on him. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in scratches, but alive. Vax Thresh stood slowly, his massive form showing signs of fatigue for the first time since Jake had met him. The other Drakmori gathered around their leader, speaking in urgent tones about his condition. "The trial is complete," Vax Thresh announced to both groups. "Ambassador Morrison has survived all 4 phases." "But so did you," Jake pointed out. "Doesn't that make it a tie?" Vax Thresh was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a new tone of respect. "No, Ambassador. You did more than survive. You adapted to each challenge and found solutions I could not have imagined. More importantly, you chose cooperation over competition when survival was at stake." The Overlord turned to address his own delegation. "This human has shown me something I did not expect to find. True strength is not just about enduring hardship or overpowering enemies. It is about finding new ways to overcome challenges and lifting others up in the process. Jake felt a surge of hope. Does this mean we can negotiate as equals? It means more than that, Vax Thresh replied. It means we have much to learn from each other. The Drakmori Empire faces enemies that resist our traditional methods. Your species' adaptability and cooperative instincts could be exactly what we need.